object. The next important topic that we are going to discuss is constructor, right? As a developer, you should know what is a constructor, what are the different types of a constructor, why we need constructor, right? What is the difference between static and a non-static constructor? What is a private constructor? So what is copy constructor? There are many things that we need to understand. So let's start discussing constructor. Right? See guys, inside a class, we have a different types of members. Right? You can see this is a class calculator. Inside this class, you can declare some variable, right? You can also define some properties, right? You can define some method like this. You can even define constructor like this, right? So you can also define constructor like this. So inside a class, we can have different types of members. We can have data member, you can have properties, you can have the data member. When I'm saying these are variables, these are properties, right? These are method and these are constructor. So understanding constructor is very important. So let us try to understand what is a constructor is, what is the need for a constructor, what are the different types of a constructor, when to use which type of a constructor, and all these things. Okay, so what is a constructor? Anybody having any idea, any definition in their mind? Can anybody tell me what is a constructor?
Constructor basically used to initialize the variables of a class.
Right. So we already discussed in this memory allocation, the new object, the new operator is going to create the memory allocation. But initializing those memory allocation will be the responsibility of the constructor. And this is the one and the only one responsibility of a constructor, initializing the memory location. Initializing the memory location means what? Initializing the memory location means initializing the variables of a class, right? Initializing the variables of a class. So in this class, if you are having few variables, so in this case, so can anybody tell me how many variables in this class?
Two.
Three variables.
Three variables. Because see, property are not going to be hold any data, but whenever we create a property, behind the scene, a private anonymous variable is created or not. We have already discussed this thing, guys, in our property session. Yes or no?
Yes, I forgot about the auto implemented.
Yeah. So whenever you create a property means it's a special kind of a function. It is not going to hold the data, right? It is basically going to set and get the data from the variable. And this is nothing but your auto-implemented properties. Auto-implemented properties means behind the scene, a private anonymous variable will be created for this property. Okay. If you want to see, okay, let us understand this practically. Right. So let me build the solution. Result where? Yeah. Okay. Right. Build successful. Where this exe is generated, this generated inside the big debug, and copy this file location and open. What we need to open, guys? Tell me. Developer command for Visual Studio, right? So once you open developer command prompt for Visual Studio, what you need to search? ILDASM. This is not case sensitive. You can write in small case, uppercase, or mixed case, no issue, right? So once you open the developer command prompt, then open ILDSM tool. IL means intermediate language disassembler, right? Open this. Go to the location where your exe is created. Once, then select the exe and open this, right? Open this. and we have created some variables inside the calculator class. So you can see this is a property, right? My property. And for this my property, there is a field of integer 32 type or not. So this is a X property, Y property you have created, right? You have created these two properties, but this property, sorry, you have created these two variable, X variable. See, whenever you are seeing this symbol, it's a variable, right? And whenever you are seeing this red type symbol, triangular, it's a property. And this constructor and this getter setter calculate sum, all are methods. And this set property and get property means they are accessor of method, and these two methods are belongs to this property only. We have already discussed this thing. So a property can have two say accessor. One is set accessor, one is get accessor, right? So for this my property, one set accessor method is there and one get accessor method is there. So they are special kind of methods. Calculate sum, it's going to be our method. We have one constructor, so this is also going to be a method. This is Y, it's a variable. X, it's a variable. And my property, it's a field. And this field is automatically generated by the compiler based on this property. So whenever you are accessing this property means this property internally setting and getting the value from this field. Is that clear?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Yeah, fine. Okay. So the point that you need to remember. So in a class, you can have many kind of data members, and those data members are going to be initialized by the constructor only. So now my question, can we initialize both static and non-static data members using constructor?
Using static constructor, we can initialize static data member.
Okay, so using static constructor, you can only initialize the static data member. Can I initialize static data member using non-static constructor?
No,
Can
sir.
I sorry?
No.
That we will see. We can initialize. That we will see practically. Can we initialize static data member using non-static constructor, or can we initialize non-static data member using static constructor? If possible, how? If not possible, why? All these things we are going to discuss in our constructor section, right? Don't worry, everything will be discussed. So the point that I need to make sure is that inside a class, so or you can say class is a collection of members like fields, variables, method, constructors, etc. Okay, sorry guys, some disturbance because of that I'm going in mute. Okay, say class is a collection of members like variables, or which you can say fields. So don't be confused with the fields and variable. They are just a alternative name. You can define methods and you can define constructors. You can define also properties. Properties, right? Properties, etc. Inside a class, so one of the most important concept is constructor. So what is a constructor? Right? What is a constructor? So constructor is a special method inside a class responsible for initializing the variable of that class. So already we discussed what is the meaning of a constructor means it is going to initialize the variable of a class, right? The name of the constructor method is exactly the same name as the class name in which it was present. If you look at this example, what is the name of the constructor means it will be same as the class name. You cannot write a constructor. See, if I'm writing 2, it will give me some error. As soon as I write 2, it is giving me some error. Method name must have a return type. So it's saying it is not a constructor. Now it's a method, and a method should have some return type. So if you write void, then it is going to work. But if I write this, then it is going to give me some error. So what error it is going to give me? See, calculator member names cannot be same as the enclosing type. So what is the enclosing type? This is a calculator. You cannot define any method with the same name. And yes, if you want to make this as a constructor, then you need to remove the return type. So the first point that you need to remember is the constructor name should be same as the class name. The constructor should not have any return type. Is that clear? Yes or no?
Yes. Yes.
For example, if your class name is employee, then the constructor method name is going to be employee. If your class name is student, then the constructor name is also going to be student. The constructor method doesn't have any return type. That means it's a non-value returning method, right? Generally, whenever we create method, we have two types of method. What are the method type? One is value returning and one is non-value returning method. So you can see calculator 1 and this is calculator 2, right? So this is a value returning method. In this case, in function article, in function section session, we have discussed. It's a method which is taking parameters and returning value. This is another kind of method which is taking parameter but not returning any value. So methods are generally two kinds based on the return type. What are the type? Either the value returns some value, you need to specify the return type, what type of value this method is going to return, and if your method doesn't return any value, then you need to specify the return type as void. But in constructor's case, you cannot use that void, right? In constructor case, you cannot use that void. Why? Because void is also return type. It doesn't, void is a return type, which means it doesn't return any value, right? It's a return type, but it does not return any value. Here, int is a return type, which return integer type of value, right? So in this case, what you need to do, we do not have to write any kind of return type, even void. It's a non-returning constructor, right? Constructor means it's a non-returning type method. But even it's a non-returning type method, you cannot use constructor. You cannot use that void. Why? Now this is to differentiate a method with a constructor, right? In method, you have return type. In constructor, if you put return type, then again it's going to be a method, right? So to differentiate between method and constructor, the constructor doesn't allow any return type. Is that clear? Clear or not?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. This is a method and this is a constructor. Both are going to be constructor. Both are going to be method only, right? When called, they will perform some tasks. But to differentiate between a method and a constructor, there is return type. In method, you have return type. Whether it is an integer, void, or anything else, that doesn't matter. But in constructor, you cannot have any return type. This is the second, right? Now, see, each and every class require one constructor. If you want to create an instance of the class, we already discussed. If you are having a class, right, and if you want to create an instance, then what is required? Constructor is required. Instance means it's a combination of two things. One is creating the memory location and another is initializing that memory location. Creating that memory location will be done by the new operator, but initializing the memory location is going to be done by the constructor, right? If you want to create an instance of a class, then you require one constructor. If you don't have a constructor, then we cannot create an instance of the class. The point that you need to remember, if your class doesn't have any constructor, then you cannot create an instance. Now, you might have one question, right? Okay. So now you might have one question, sir. You are saying if your class doesn't have any constructor, then you cannot create an instance. But in this case, I'm able to create the instance of the class constructor or not? In this calculator class, we have defined any constructor? Is there any constructor inside this calculator class? As a programmer, we defined any constructor? No, we have not defined any constructor. And here, we are creating an instance of the calculator class or not? Then how it is possible? That is the
Calculator.
Sorry?
Calculator itself is acting as a constructor.
No, calculator it's a class. Calculator it's not acting as a constructor, it's a class. So see, whenever to understand this, what I can do is, okay.
In this case, the constructor will be
Let me create a static method void some method, right? Right. So when this some method is going to be executed, when this method is going to be executed, when you invoke this method, na? So as a static method, you can invoke this method directly using the class name. So class name dot some method, right? When this statement means execute means this method is going to be executed, and as part of this method, whatever logic you have written, that is going to be executed. So this is nothing but your constructor call. That means whenever this statement is executed, the constructor that is defined inside your calculator class is going to be executed. For example, if I'm creating the constructor like this, right? Suppose I'm creating this as a calculator and taking some integer x, right? That means, so you cannot write static void inside your constructor, then you need to pass some 10. So this is your constructor calling, right? Whenever you call this constructor, then the constructor which is defined inside your class is going to be executed. Yes or no? And when this constructor will execute, then it will initialize the data member of your class. Guys, please observe this carefully. This is, it creates the memory. It creates the memory allocation, right? It allocate that there are 4 or 5 variables are there, and for based on the data type, it will allocate some memory inside the RAM, right? Inside the RAM means that in RAM we have 2 types of memory. One is stack and inside in another is heap. Inside the heap memory, it will allocate the memory. Inside the heap memory, it will allocate or it will reserve memory for this variable. But when this is nothing but one function call. You can consider it's a function call. 1 minute, guys. Let's take a break for 5 minutes. Then I will be back. So 5 minutes break. Then I will be back. Guys, back. All are back.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so basically, whenever you are making this, means it is nothing but a function call. That means this function should be exist in your method, in your class. See, function and constructor are not two different things. Constructor is a special kind of a function which doesn't have any return type. That the point. If you want to differentiate between a constructor and a function, means constructor is a special kind of a function which doesn't have any return type, and you can only invoke the constructor while creating the instance. You can create the other function anywhere, right? But if you want to invoke the constructor, means only while creating the instance. And it is a special kind of function. Why? Because it is the same name as the class name, and it doesn't have any return type. So in this case, when we invoke this, so this constructor is going to be executed, right? If the class doesn't have this constructor, then you will get some error, right? That means there is no constructor which is taking one parameter. But when I remove this parameter, this error is gone. That means what? Now, without constructor, you cannot initialize this data member. That means your class should have at least one constructor to initialize the data member. But then you have one question. So now this class doesn't have any constructor. Then how this statement is going to be executed, right? So whenever you do not define any constructor explicitly, then the compiler is going to provide you one implicit constructor, right? For example, to understand this, please have a look at this example. So you can see this is my class test integer I. This is the class, and you can say this is the source code. In this class, I have not defined any constructor, right? After compilation, this code will be generated, right? In this code, you can see one constructor is added by the compiler. That is a public constructor. That is a parameterless constructor is added inside the class. That means as a developer, if you have not defined any constructor explicitly, then the compiler is going to provide that constructor after compilation of your. And that constructor is going to be a parameterless, means doesn't take any parameter, and it is going to be a public, right? Now, in this case, we have not defined any constructor inside the calculator class. Now let's build the solution and let's open the ILDA sample once more. Now go to the exe file and open this exe file, right? This is my namespace inside this calculator class. See, we have two constructors, CTR, CCTR, right? So we have not defined a single constructor. Then also compiler is providing two constructor. Then if you observe this constructor carefully, both are going to be void only. Void means they are not taking any parameter, right? So they are parameterless constructor. And if you observe this carefully, this constructor CTR is specified with the word S, and this is without word S. That means this is the static constructor provided by the compiler, and this is the non-static constructor that is also provided by the compiler. That means in our example, two constructors are going to be provided by the compiler, right? Why two constructor? If you want to understand why two constructor, then we need to understand the data member care, right? See, here we have some non-static data member and we have some static data member. The point that you need to understand is, for initializing the non-static data member, we have non-static constructor, this one. But for initializing the static data member, we have the static constructor, this one. So the point that you need to remember is, the static data member are going to be initialized by the static constructor, and non-static data members are going to be initialized by the non-static constructor, right? In your class, if you do not provide any constructor explicitly, then it is mandatory one non-static constructor will be there. It is mandatory one non-static constructor will be there. It doesn't matter whether your class having any static data, whether having any non-static member or not, right? It doesn't matter whether a class having any non-static member or not. If your class is not a static class, then by default, and it is mandatory, the compiler will going to provide you one non-static constructor. But coming to the static constructor, it's depend. It's depend means if your class having any static data member, then only the static constructor going to be provided by the compiler. If your class doesn't have any static data member, then no static constructor will be provided by the compiler. To understand this, let us build the application, right? See, every time you changes, you need to close that ILDSM tool, and every time you need to run the ILDSM tool. Otherwise, it will not affect ILDSM. Okay, now if you open the code, right, then you will see that only one constructor, only one non-static constructor. See, only one non-static constructor. Why no static constructor? Static constructor in this case is not there. Why? The reason is our class doesn't have any static member. We have commented this one. If your class doesn't have any static member, then static constructor will not be provided. But it doesn't matter if whether your class having any static member or not, whether having any non-static member or not, non-static constructor will be there. Why? Because see, because this is a class, this is a non-static class. If your class doesn't have any non-static member, then also you can create the instance. Na? Creating instance is there. While you are creating the instance, that means if you are creating the instance means you can create the instance and you can invoke this method. Your class doesn't need any data member, that is fine, but your class having some method. Na? If you want to invoke that method, then you need to create an instance, and to create an instance, the constructor is need to be required, and for that reason it provide you the constructor even though your class doesn't have any data member, any non-static data member. Is that clear? Why the constructor providing you by the compiler if your class doesn't have any non-static data member?
Yeah, it's clear.
Yeah. So this is the thing that you need to remember and observe. So now you can understand this code clearly. If your class, suppose you are creating a class test, and in this class you have defined only one data member, integer I, right? And this class doesn't have any constructor. But after compilation, the class structure should be like this. This should be this is nothing but the IL code of this class, right? So once you compile, you will get the IL code. This is nothing but your IL code. This IL code of this class is this. So in this case, the compiler will provide the static non-static constructor. Why? Because there is no static member, so no static constructor, and non-static constructor is mandatory. And what this non-static constructor will do, it will initialize this variable with the default value 0. Why 0? Because we are not initializing with any value. Na? If you are initializing this variable with 100, then it will initialize that variable with the value 100. But we are not providing any value. If we are not providing any value, then what is the default value of an integer data type? The default value of an integer data type is 0. So it will initialize that variable with the value 0. Is that clear?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now, if your class having some other variable, some integer type variable, some string type variable, some boolean type variable, right? Then how the initialization will take place? The same thing. The compiler will provide you the non-static constructor. That constructor is parameterless, and that constructor is going to be public one, and that constructor is going to initialize all the data member with the default value, right? So for integer, for numeric data type, the default value is 0. For string data type or object data type or reference data type, the default value is going to be null. For boolean data type, the default value is going to be false. So it will initialize the class with these default values. Is that clear? Yes or no?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Right. To understand this, okay. To understand this example, let us understand this example. See, here I'm creating one class. This is the same example. What you can see in the picture. This class ISB, and here you can see I, S, and a B, 3 variables, right? And here I'm creating an object of this class. Once I create the object means it will initialize this variable with the default value, right? And whenever initialize with the default value, for integer you will get the value as 0. For boolean you will get the value as false. For string you will get the null. Null you cannot print in the console, right? Null means nothing, not a value, right? So in this case, what I'm doing, I'm checking if s value is null, then I'm printing s equals to null. That means if s storing the value null, that means this statement is going to be executed, right? So now run the application and see the output. Okay, so yeah, can anybody tell me why my application is not compiled? Why I'm getting this error?
Do you have the indeterminate language disassembler running?
No. So because we have opened the ILDSM tool for this application and we have not closed that one. So if you want to run your application and if you want to build, first of all, you need to close the ILDSM tool. So I just close it, and once I close, right, then I can start running the application and it should work. See, for I, it is printing the default value 0. For B, it is printing the default value. For C, it's printing the default value null. Right? For S, it is printing. That means we are not initializing our data member, but we are getting the value. What it means? It means someone is initializing these variables or not. Then who is initializing this variable? The constructor is initializing this variable. Then you will ask, so we are not defining any constructor. Yes, we are not defining any constructor. Then if you are not providing any constructor explicitly in our class, then the compiler will provide one constructor, and that constructor is going to be initialize the data member. Is that clear? Yes or no?
Yes.
Okay. So a few points to remember while working with a constructor. Implicitly defined constructors are parameterless, and these constructors are also known as default constructor. This is because they are used to initialize the variable with default. In this case, we have not defined any constructor, but the constructor which is going to be provided by the compiler is going to be parameterless and public. So you can see this is parameterless and public, and this constructor is going to initialize the variable with the default value, right? You cannot provide any explicitly values to this variable using the implicit constructor. Implicit constructor means default value. Default values means if the variable is not assigned with any value, then it will take the default value, and if you initialize the variable with some value, that some value will be assigned. But you cannot provide any additional or any value from outside, right? You cannot pass any value while creating the object, right? Whatever the value is there, that value is going to be taken, right? And if you are not initializing with any value, okay, let me clarify this. Suppose I'm creating this S1, right? So S1 with some value high, then it will take the high value, right? So what I'm doing, I'm just printing the else part, and here I'm printing s equals to obj.s. So in this case, these two will be take the default value of the data type, and in this case, what is the default value you assign to this variable, that is going to be printed. See, high is printed or not? But the point that is, you cannot specify any value. Suppose you want to provide some value while creating the object, that is not possible through implicit constructor. That is possible using explicit constructor, that we will see. But for implicit constructor, you cannot provide any additional or any value while creating the constructor, right? So what is the default value based on the data type, or what is the default value you assign, that is going to be, right? And it doesn't matter how many number of objects you are going to be created, this default value is going to be assigned each time you create an instance of this test class. Is that clear?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
now if you read this statement, then you will understand these things clearly. Implicitly defined constructors are parameterless. These constructors are also known as default constructor. This is because they are used to initialize the variable with default value. Any doubt regarding this statement?
Yes.
No.
Okay. Implicitly defined constructors are public, right? If you see in our example, we define the class test with a default access specifier, but the constructor is public, which is generated by the compiler. You can see the default constructor is going to be public. We can also define a constructor under the class, and if we define it, we call it an explicit constructor. And an explicit constructor can be parameterless or can be parameterized. For example, now I can define one constructor like this. So this is a constructor which is defined by the user. This is a parameterless constructor. I can also define another constructor who is taking some parameter. So this is a parameterized constructor. So as a user, we can define explicitly constructor in our application, and that constructor may be parameterless or parameterized. Okay, no issue. Okay, fine. So you understand these two things? The explicit constructor, the user given constructor, can be parameterless and can be parameterized, right? Now we have discussed this example. This example we have discussed now. So now I hope you have a very good idea regarding constructor. Now we will see how to define constructor and the in-depth concept of constructor. So if you want to define constructor, this is the syntax. So defining constructor means explicitly constructor. We are not going to learn implicit constructor because implicit constructor is managed by the compiler automatically, right? As a developer, we do not have any control over the implicit constructor, right? And implicit constructor functionality is limited. What is limited? Now the constructor is going to be public. The constructor doesn't take any parameter, and the constructor is going to initialize the data member with the default value. Default values means if we assign some value in the variable initialization statement, then that value will be assigned. If not assigned, then what is the default value for the data type? Based on the data type, it will initialize the variable. That is the limited functionality for the constructor. Now we are going to define constructor explicitly means we need to understand what are the things we can do with the constructor and what are the things we cannot do with the constructor, in how many ways we can define the constructor, what are the different types of a constructor we can define in CSharp language. That is the things we need to understand. Now you can observe here, you can apply modifiers, class name and parameter lists and statement. So here class name means nothing but your constructor name. Modifier means it can be public, private, protected, internal, private, protected, internal, right? All these things you can apply here. Yeah, see, we have 6 types of access specifier. We'll discuss those 6 types of access specifier in our access specifier in CSharp article. But currently, I'm only using public, private, protected because these 3 access specifier are available in other programming languages also. If you have any knowledge regarding C++, then you might know. So that's why I'm currently using public, private, protected. But apart from these 3 access specifier, we have additional 3 access specifier that we will discuss in detail, right? So then class name is nothing but your name of the class, which is going to be your constructor name, and parameter list. So whenever I'm writing something in between square bracket, that means that is optional. And if I'm writing using this angular bracket, that is mandatory. So here you can see this parameter modifiers I have written using this square bracket means it's optional. Parameter is optional, but class name is mandatory. And as part of the statement, you can write any valid .NET statement. Okay. Now let us understand this explicit constructor with one example. So here you can see I have one class called explicit constructor, and I have defined one explicit constructor. And in this explicit constructor, I have written one statement. Right, the constructor is defined as public, and this constructor is parameterless. Right, that means when I create an object of this when I create an object of this class, then this constructor is going to be fired, and this constructor is going to fire means when this statement is executed. And once this statement is executed, the controller will move to this location, and here it will execute the body. Here you can write any valid .NET statement. Here for simplicity, I'm just writing one right line statement. Now if you run the application, you will see that this statement is executed. Yeah, explicit constructor is called. So the one more point that you need to remember is how many instances you created. Okay, that many times the constructor is called. Okay, so let us prove this. So how many instances you created, that many times the constructor is going to be called. For example, here you can see I have created 4 instances, right? That means this constructor is going to be called for 4 times. Let's see this. See, this constructor is executed 4 times. That means the number of times the instances you created, the same number of times the constructor is going to be executed. Right? Is that clear?
Yes.
Okay. See, so one clarity you need to be have. So many people are saying that constructor implicitly called or automatically called. In many articles on the web, you will see that constructor is a special member function which called automatically, which called implicitly, right? This is wrong. Constructor is not called automatically. Constructor always going to be called explicitly, right? So, for example, you can say, listen, this is your test class, right? So this example we have already seen. This is your test class. Okay, let me copy the code. Okay. Okay. So this people are saying that the constructor called automatically or implicitly whenever we create an instance. So how it is implicitly, how it is automatically? Yeah. So defining the constructor might be implicitly or explicitly. If you are not defining the constructor explicitly, then implicitly compiler will provide. But calling is always going to be explicitly. How? Why I'm saying explicitly? You can see this is what is this? This is your constructor call. That means as a programmer, you are calling this constructor explicitly or not. So this is your class. So here you can see class constructor demo.test. So if I move the mouse pointer over here, you can see it is saying it's a class, right? So if I move the mouse pointer here, it's saying it's a class constructor demo.test. But when I move the mouse pointer to this, say it is not saying it's a class. It's saying it is invoking the text constructor of text class. Yes or no? It is invoking the text constructor of text class. And this statement we have written or not? Everything, anything, if you are written, that means that is explicit. And in this case, this constructor calling statement you have written or this statement is provided by compiler?
We have written, yes.
So if we have written means we are explicitly calling the constructor or not? Yes, that
Yes.
calling constructor is implicitly defined by the compiler, right? But we are calling that constructor explicitly, right? So you need to understand this thing. So what is things? So see here, test is a class belongs to the constructor demo namespace, but here you are making call to the constructor. Text is the class name, and this is your constructor, right? So here you can see explicitly constructor is a class present under the constructor demo namespace. In this case, you are calling the constructor explicitly, but which constructor is going to be invoked? The implicitly constructor, which is defined by the compiler. Is that clear? In this example.
Yes.
Okay, so in this case, you are not defining any constructor explicitly. That means the compiler will defined by the constructor will be defined by the compiler implicitly, and that is going to be your default constructor, and that constructor you are calling here explicitly. That is the point that you need to remember. Calling the constructor explicitly, yes, the constructor definition might be implicit or explicitly. If you are defining, then that is explicitly. If you are not defining, then the compiler will provide, and that will be implicitly, right? And here you can say, we are invoking the constructor, right? Again, this is your constructor calling statement. That means you are explicitly calling the constructor, and this time it is going to invoke the explicit constructor. And in the previous example, it is going to invoke the implicit constructor. Then you might be confused with two terms. Sir, what is defining and what is calling constructor? Yes or no? So you need to understand these two terms very carefully. What is defining a constructor and what is calling a constructor? See, defining a constructor means implementing a constructor in your class. Defining a constructor means implementing a constructor in your class. And the defining can be two types, implicit and explicitly. Implicit means the compiler will define the constructor for your class. Explicitly means as a developer, you only need to define the constructor for your class, right? So in this example, you can see we are defining the constructor explicitly. And if you do not provide this constructor, then compiler is going to provide you one implicit constructor. Right, so constructor definition can be in two ways, implicitly or explicitly. Is that clear? Yes,
Yes,
or no,
yes.
guys? Yes.
Yes, sir.
Calling means this is the calling statement. It is not. It is always going to be explicit. It is never going to be implicit. Right? You are creating constructor means you are calling the constructor. Right? Calling is always going to be explicitly. Can you create an object without writing this statement? No, you cannot create. If you cannot create an object using this statement, that means you are not. That means your constructor is not invoked. When your object is going to be created, when you use new and a constructor, right? New is creating the object and constructor is going to be initialize the object. Independent, a particular keyword doesn't do anything, right? If you want to create an object, means both should be exist. New keyword as well as a constructor, right? So this is the point that you need to understand. Defining can be implicitly or explicitly, but calling is always going to be